Hi guys, in this video we're going to look at the stages of pregnancy. We're going to start at fertilization and then move all the way through until having a baby. So as I said, we'll start with fertilization. Fertilization is when the sperm, being the male gamete, fuses with the egg or ova, being the female gamete. And once this egg is fertilized, it forms what is called a zygote. Now the way that it does this, because the egg has a protective coating around it, the sperm actually releases an enzyme which thins that protective coating so that it can get into the egg. And once it penetrates and gets into the egg then releases an enzyme that stops any other sperm from getting into it to make sure that only one sperm meets one egg. Now this process of fertilization usually occurs in the fallopian tube a few days after ovulation. This zygote then has a few days, between generally about 4 and 6, where it undergoes mitosis. So that's cell division, where each time it doubles the amount of cells it has. So it starts off as 1 fertilized cell, then 2, then 4, then 8, then 16, and continues like this. After this 4 to 6 days, this zygote matures into a blastocyst. And a blastocyst, rather than being a bunch of cells, like the zygote we can see in the center there, we start to get some differentiation. This means that some of the cells start to take on different roles. And we can see that there is this bit around the outside and this little bit in the inside. Now you don't need to know the names of these, but this little bit in the inside is what is eventually going to become the embryo. Then implantation occurs. This is where that blastocyst implants itself on the endometrium, which is the inside layer of the wall of the uterus. This time a placenta starts to form. Now, the placenta is an organ that provides nutrients, so food, as well as oxygen for the developing embryo, as well as removing the waste. And the way it does this is by having lots and lots of tiny little blood vessels in it, and those tiny little blood vessels of the embryo lined up with tiny little blood vessels from the mother. And there's only a couple of cells between the blood from the mother and the embryo. And nutrients are able to pass through those cells to the embryo, and wastes are able to pass through those cells back to the mother. The way that the embryo is attached to the placenta is through a rope-like cord called the umbilical cord, which has got a whole heap of blood vessels in it, moving the blood into the embryo from that placenta. Now, an interesting point here is that both the embryo and the mother have completely different circulatory systems. So their blood doesn't mix at all. It just moves very close to each other, so close that things can pass from one set of blood to the other. Another thing that happens at this time is the amniotic fluid. And the amniotic fluid is a watery-like substance that is inside the sac where the embryo is living, I suppose, at this stage. And it protects, so it's like a watery cushion that protects the embryo from outside force. So in case the mother walks into the door or something, this will protect the embryo. Another thing that happens here is the cervix gets plugged up by a mucus plug. Okay, so the cervix, the mucus which it usually produces due to the hormone change that occurs, becomes stickier and stickier and plugs up the cervix, allowing this seal so all this good stuff can happen inside the uterus and none of it's going to get out or bad things get in. We break the stages of a pregnancy down into 12-week blocks referred to as trimesters. In the first trimester, that embryo continues to grow and develop, and most of the development of structures within the embryo occurs at this time. So things like the heart develops, the brain, eyes, lungs, kidneys, all of these organs are present inside a 12-week-old embryo. And you can see from the pictures here that once you're starting to get to about 10 weeks, it is very obvious that it's a baby human there. In those previous weeks, it's not as obvious. And an interesting point here is that the embryos of most mammals in that early development stages look very similar to each other. By the second trimester, we now refer to that embryo as a fetus. And this second trimester goes for another 12 weeks. And during this time, the heartbeat can be heard using different instruments, as well as the mother will start to feel movement. And this will happen at about 16 weeks into the pregnancy. And we start to get small features form on the fetus, such as fingernails and toenails, as well as hair growing. One of the ways in which we're able to detect this heartbeat is through an ultrasound. Now, an ultrasound is an external diagnosis that blasts a very high frequency sound into the uterus of the female, and the echoes from this sound create this grainy picture that you can see here. And it looks quite grainy to us, but the sonographers who are trained in getting these ultrasounds can actually get quite a lot of information out of them. Now, I've said here that by the second trimester we can see it on ultrasound. You can see it on the fetus on by ultrasound earlier, but not through an external ultrasound. You generally have to take an internal ultrasound, and it's not in a form that most of us would be able to recognize as a fetus or a baby. By the third trimester, the fetus is gaining most of its weight. Lots and lots of weight is gained at this time. Most of the growing and development is done, and it's just putting on weight. By this time, it is so large and cramped inside the uterus that it's difficult for movement to occur. So hopefully by this stage, the head is down near the cervix, because if the baby's the wrong way around at this stage, it can be very hard for it to turn ready for birth. Okay. Birth occurs at about 38 to 40 weeks of development, and the child is born. The process is that the mucus plug falls out and lets out the amniotic fluid, or the amniotic sac breaks, letting out the amniotic fluid, and this is referred to as the waters breaking. So if you've heard that before, that's what that's referring to. The cervix, which had this plug in it and was about 8 centimeters thick, then thins to about 2 centimeters and dilates, so it gets larger, till the time that it's about 10 centimeters wide. And most of the contractions that happen during childbirth are actually this thinning and dilating of the cervix. Once the cervix has dilated to this 10 centimeters, the baby is then pushed out the vagina. And by this time, the baby's quite big, so getting through the birth canal is a little bit tricky. But there's a funny little twist that the baby does at this stage so that it can fit its shoulders through the pelvis. If a baby is breech, and I talked about being backwards in the uterus before, having the feet down, this is a very dangerous situation for both baby and mother. So therefore, in the case of breech, usually the baby will be born by a caesarean. And how a caesarean works is an incision is made into the abdomen or through the abdomen and into the uterus, and the baby is then removed through the abdomen, leaving a cut or scar in the stomach. Now, this isn't what you want. It is much more dangerous, being that it's surgery. However, in some circumstances, such as breech and emergencies, this is the only option. After the birth, by either method, hopefully we are left with a healthy baby. In Australia, the average baby weighs about 3.5 kilos. And you'll notice in this picture, it's covered in a white, I suppose, cheesy layer. This is called vernix and protects the baby while in the uterus, as well as lubricates it as it comes down the birth canal. In this video, we've looked at the process of pregnancy from fertilization to birth. We talked about the fertilization of the two gametes fusing to form a zygote. That zygote then differentiating into a blastocyst before implanting on the uterus wall, forming a placenta in its amniotic sac of fluid. The first trimester, where most of the structural development happens. The second trimester, where finer things are happening, and some of those organs start functioning. Ultrasound being a way of seeing a fetus inside the mother. The third trimester, where the majority of the weight is put on, and then natural birth through the vagina or Caesarean section through an incision in the abdomen, leaving us with a baby that weighs about 3.5 kilos. Thanks for watching, guys. Peace out.